So many people who might be seeing this video or joining us on a Sunday morning may not realize where the readings and where the scripture choices come from on my part. But I usually follow what's called the lectionary. The lectionary is kind of a traditional cycle of readings that many churches throughout the world kind of follow, and they follow this cycle of readings over a course of 3 years. And so I like the idea that many churches, our brothers and sisters all around the world, are praying through and thinking about the same things that we are on any given morning. Um, this summer, I'm actually going to break away from that a little bit, and we're going to do what's often called a series. I would like us to spend some time looking at the weird, bizarre book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament for the next handful of weeks. And so this talk is largely going to function as kind of an introduction to this book, which we are going to be spending some time with because I just think, as strange as the book seems at first appearance, it has a lot to teach us because a lot of its strangeness comes from a very extreme set of circumstances that the writer Ezekiel found himself in. And I think there are probably more parallels with the modern world than we often are comfortable with. So, to really understand the context that this prophet Ezekiel is teaching, and we actually have to go back a little bit and kind of talk about the geopolitical politics that had been happening the last couple hundred years for him in the Middle East and his own kind of country nation of Israel. So, God established this country of Israel for a very specific purpose. He calls them a kingdom of priests. He calls them kind of his representation on earth. They're almost ambassadors from God to the rest of humanity. And as such, God has pretty strong expectations for them. And this is, again, a deal that they signed up for, saying, I need you to behave a certain way morally. I need you to identify yourselves away from the rest of the world in some very specific ways because I need you to represent me and show me what the world is like. And that calling, that representing of God being his ambassadors to the world, is one that the ancient people of Israel and the modern church both fail in all the time. There's a lot of grace and mercy there. But at this point in history, that God was kind of saying, it's time for just kind of a cleansing. And so, due to some unfaithfulness among the kings and the leadership, the country had been split into two, one larger kingdom called Israel, one smaller kingdom called Judah. And the larger kingdom of Israel had basically been completely destroyed. The big bad kind of superpower of its day was Assyria. Assyria was just a nasty, nasty country. They were known for their brutality and their cruelty. And when this much smaller nation of Israel, again, God's representatives on earth, chose to no longer accept God's protection, they kind of, said in a lot of ways, hey, we got this thing, we're not going to represent you, we're not going to do things this way. They, in fact, lost their homeland. Many of them were killed, and the rest of them were kind of scattered to the wind. They were put into exile. And so the smaller nation of Judah, the king at the time was a man named Hezekiah. Hezekiah kind of learned the lesson. He says, look, we're not big and powerful enough to stand up in this world against places like Assyria or against places like Egypt, who lives down in the south. We need God's help. We need God's protection to do so. We need to connect with him again. And so he starts this kind of revival. This revival kind of falls apart really quickly with his son. His son, who says almost the exact opposite. His son is named Manasseh, and he has an unusually long reign. And what he says is, no, we need to not be trusting God. We need to be trusting kind of any power we can get our hands on. So he's a pragmatist, I guess, if not a bit of a cynic. And so he turns to any god he can get his hands on. He turns to politics. He turns to anything to try and protect his country, to try and turn away from these two big superpowers that are battling it out on either side of him, of Egypt and Assyria. This policy doesn't go super well for him. And at the time of his grandson, things have really heated up. Things are going very poorly. His grandson Josiah again kind of follows in the vein of Hezekiah and says, No, we need to trust God, because he looks at the law and says, look, we entered a very specific deal with God, this covenant, saying we were going to be your people and we would trust you and you alone to get us out of this mess we found ourselves in. And so he starts another major revival. He tries to bring the hearts of the people back. And he meets with some success. They actually enjoy a level of freedom that had not been experienced up until that point in a long time. And he makes friends with this new kind of up and coming nation called Babylon, and pressure from them gets kind of these other big two bullies, Assyria and Egypt, to back down. And so Josiah, because of this kind of sort of unofficial friendship with the country of Babylon, at one point comes and tries to fight and protect when he hears Assyria and Babylon are fighting. He tries to get involved and is in fact killed as a young man. And so the reason I'm kind of explaining all of these is our hero our hero Ezekiel, the prophet who is involved in all this, grows up under Josiah. He's a priest. And so he, as a young man, has heard stories of how horrible things were spiritually and politically under Manasseh. And they are excited because he grows up in this environment that, no, we are in fact going to choose God. God is going to protect us. Things are going to be okay again. And then as he is getting into young adulthood, he is entering into this incredible role of being a priest of God, of a nation who have chosen God again, and things are going to change despite being so difficult politically for such a long time. And then Josiah, this young king who's leading revival, is killed. He's killed in a battle with Egypt. Egypt comes in, sacks the city, and puts their own king in charge, who does not like Babylon, because Egypt and Assyria are trying to fight off this town of Babylon. And so just the crushing defeat that Ezekiel feels of just betrayal, right? Like, God, this guy is doing everything right. He's reviving. Had a good thing going. Why did this young man die so tragically and so soon? And yet it's about to get a lot worse, because Egypt and Assyria, in a kind of, weird political bedfellows, end up allying together to try and fight this kind of new upstart nation of Babylon. And shockingly, Babylon defeats both of these nations so badly that neither of them are really powers in the ancient Near East really ever again in human history. And then Babylon turns to its former ally that now has a pro-Egyptian king. This little town of Jerusalem comes in again, sacks it, burns it, and he takes kind of the cream of the crop of society, its best artisans, its priests, its royalty, and he takes them all the way to basically what's the end of the earth in their mind, back to the home city of Babylon. And Ezekiel is one of these priests who is taken. And so he's this young man who not only all his hopes that he'd grown up with, this hope of being a priest in the temple of God, and yet now he doesn't even have a homeland anymore. He doesn't have an identity anymore. He doesn't know who he is. And they're, of course, questioning, like, God, what are you up to? Everything was going so well, and then everything completely collapsed again. And so it's in the midst of this total kind of collapse, this total chaos geopolitically, just this total loss of his own identity and his sense of calling and sense of purpose, living, in exile as not even an immigrant, as a refugee. Ezekiel finds himself trying to minister to people that God is still good, when I wonder if he wasn't questioning that himself. And Ezekiel, far away, wondering if God is still around, wondering if God is still good, starts having these kind of dream visions. It's interesting that this is the way that God chooses to speak to him, because we do have some kind of earlier examples of God speaking directly to people in these huge visions, when in kind of the big prophets of Isaiah and of Jeremiah. And yet his the way he writes it, the way he describes it, sounds a lot more like kind of these prophetic dream visions that were common in the culture he was in at the time. In the culture of Babylon, they believed that these big visions were one of the ways towards kind of spiritual enlightenment. And so God begins speaking to him in a way that probably would have felt a little bit foreign to him, in a way that makes sense in the context. And God gives him a difficult ministry, but one that is ultimately about hope. And to do that, God has to kind of show the bigger picture here. The bigger picture is not helping them get back what they really wanted, but again, in fact, helping God's people get back what they really needed. And the first part of kind of his message, one of the most difficult parts, is kind of dismantling this false hope that Ezekiel and kind of the other exiles had, and that was the fact that they were going to get to go back home. The fact that everything would be okay if we could just get back to the temple, if we could get back to the promised land that you gave us. God, it takes a while, but God basically reveals to him and is arguing the hearts of the people are still so corrupt, so bent on not trusting me, that I really need to allow circumstances to kind of uncover the filth of soul that is in Jerusalem at the time. And so Ezekiel, where he feels crushed, he actually gets to be part of rebuilding this healthy core of people who, in fact, will one day kind of carry the torch, be able to represent God to the world, be able to kind of continue this story of hope. But the circumstances are just so extreme, and I think this dream of going back home and of fixing things, getting things back the way they used to be, are so entrenched. I think to break that down, God has to use some pretty extreme measures in both Ezekiel's life and the message he gives, and just use some very extreme imagery. He ends up becoming kind of almost a street theater actor, or something that was kind of similar to the modern avant-garde in art. God has to use very extreme images, and he has to have Ezekiel perform again to break down this hope, this false hope that they would go back home and that everything would be okay. And I think another really important thing from Ezekiel's story is a lot of the bizarre actions he has to take. Like some of the first ones he has to do are he loses the ability to speak unless God is directly speaking through him. This goes on for several years. The only time he can talk is when he's directly giving God's messages. Another just kind of bizarre thing is he has to show the amount of time that is going to elapse till people can go back home, and it's much, much longer than they desire. Years and years and years, generations, until people will head back to what they consider home. And to represent this, he's forced to basically be a cripple and lay on his side for long amounts of time. And so this theme of, in some ways, his own physical pain, his own representation of the pain of others, of eating very small amounts of food as they would have been doing back home as they are beginning to starve, he kind of sets up kind of the prototype in a lot of ways of bearing the pain for another person that God is, of course, going to refer to and show when he himself comes and bears our own pain. So it's important to remember that God never asks anything of Ezekiel, even though it's a really hard gig, that he himself is not willing to do later in Jesus, carrying others' pain and suffering to even a more extreme point in the point of the cross. But the final point out of kind of Ezekiel's calling, and I think the reminder of why all this story is for us, comes out of a little section in Ezekiel chapter 3. And this is kind of what I think is kind of a core of what it is God is trying to teach Ezekiel and the responsibility he sees Ezekiel capable of handling. So I'm going to look in Ezekiel chapter 3. I'm going to start up in verse 12, giving you kind of a sense of God catching Ezekiel up and what some of these kind of responsibilities he have as God talks to him. So Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 12 says, "Then a wind lifted me, and I heard behind me a great quaking sound. Yahweh's splendor be blessed in this place, and the sound of these creatures' wings beating against each other, and the sound of the wheels alongside them, a great quaking sound. When a wind lifted me up and took me, I went, bitter and in the wrath of my spirit, with God's strong hand on me." So he didn't have a lot of control always. Sometimes it was difficult. These messages he had, it was not something that didn't cost him a lot. And yet by the end, we'll see this is something that Ezekiel seems to think is worth it. "So I came to the exile community at Tel Aviv, living near the river Kebar. I lived there where they were living. I lived there desolate for 7 days. And at the end of those 7 days, Yahweh's word finally came to me. 'Young man, I'm making you a lookout or a watchman for Israel's household. You're to listen to the word from my mouth and warn them from me. When I say about the faithless person, you will definitely die, and you don't warn him and don't speak to warn the faithless person from his faithless way to keep him alive, he, the faithful person, will die for his waywardness, but I shall look for his blood from your hand. And you, when you warn the faithless person, he doesn't turn back from his faithlessness, and from his faithless way, he will die for his waywardness, but you will have saved your life. And when a faithful person turns back from his faithfulness and does what is evil, and I put an obstacle before him, he will die, because you didn't warn him. For his wrongdoing he'll die, for his faithful acts that he has done won't be borne in mind, but I shall look for his blood from your hand. But you, when you warn him, the faithful person, that the faithful person shouldn't do wrong, and he doesn't do wrong, you will definitely live, because he let himself be warned, and you yourself will have saved your life." This image is such an interesting one, in that he's asking Ezekiel to be kind of a watchman, or a lookout for other people's lives. And this reminds us what God is trying to do so much of the time. God desires, especially in really intense, confusing situations like Ezekiel found himself, and like we often find ourselves nowadays, in a world that the geopolitical situation doesn't always make sense, when the just levels of despair and addiction are frightening in the world, and people feel confused as to what God is doing. God starts offering hope and rebuilding in Ezekiel's life, and I think often in ours, with this kind of simple reminder that we bear responsibility for one another. The things we have seen from God, the things that God has done in our lives, are meant for others. And I can think of so many situations where we look at people and we can sometimes see these patterns of despair, or these awful habits, or just the sorrow in their lives, and we don't feel responsible for that. We'll say, "Oh, it is their life. I don't want to be pushy. I don't want to butt in there." And this isn't to say that we're supposed to do that in an obnoxious way, talking, pointing out sin and all that stuff. Like, we've seen that in our culture, people that are just rude and ugly about it. But we are supposed to not just care, but to see and to bear responsibility. And so this image that Ezekiel has is to say, no, when I give you insight, when I call you and tell you things, I do this for the benefit of other people. I expect you to share this thing. And at the end of the day, I bear you responsible for the things you see. In a confusing world in which it is difficult to find hope, like the one Ezekiel has and the one we often have, I think God is asking us to take responsibility for those folks around us, for their well-being, and for just kind of the growth and health of them, both spiritually and physically. At Wayfarers, this is kind of one of our main premises of why we do the community organizing when we do, why we are organizing public events, why we get to know our neighbors, why we try and invite people into our lives, and why we try to get involved in theirs. And that is to see and to bless. And I wonder, are we spending enough time actually looking at the people around us, of having responsibility for them and their spiritual well-being and their physical well-being? We can't just look at people as individuals living their life. We need to see them the way God sees them, as people who are sometimes deeply lost, sometimes people who are following Him, but all of us need help. All of us are stumbling. I would hope that those of you who know me would take this calling seriously in my life. If you see things that are deeply wrong, I would hope you warn me. I would hope you help me make better choices and heal. I would hope you are like Ezekiel, a watchman to me. And I think we need to put ourselves in situations in life where we do the same for others. We are not just responsible for ourselves and our choices. In a world in which despair often reigns, in which we don't understand the context, God wants to offer us hope. And I think we can learn from this weird book of Ezekiel that hope sometimes starts with taking responsibility for the well-being of others. It sometimes starts with just praying over and seeing well the people around us and saying, okay, it is actually my responsibility to make sure that they are thriving in every sense, rather than just worrying about me and my own. And so we're going to keep journeying with this book of Ezekiel. I know this is a little all over the place, but I think this book has a lot to teach us, and I think there are a lot of parallels to kind of our contemporary world if we're willing to continue digging in with Ezekiel, as we're going to do this summer.